Hello, everyone. Thank you to those who are joining us this evening for the first of two webinars this fall on aquaculture. My name is Azure Sigler. I work at the Coastal Resources Center at the University of Rhode Island and with Rhode Island Sea Grant at the Graduate School Oceanography campus. We're so glad you can be here today. Today we have joining us Professor Dale Levitt from Roger Williams University, who will give the first presentation, and also Alan Desbonnet from Rhode Island Sea Grant. The webinars are part of a continuing aquaculture education project funded through NOAA and a collaboration with Dale Levitt and Roger Williams University, the Coastal Resources Management Council here in Rhode Island, and us at the Coastal Resources Center in Rhode Island Sea Grant. For more information, you can visit us at www.rismp.org. Great. The aim of the webinar tonight is to provide you with details on what aquaculture is, what it looks like, how it works, some of the numbers, and the overall process in Rhode Island. It's also to offer highlights from the research, either just completed or underway, that relates to aquaculture in Rhode Island. On November 30th, we'll have another webinar presented by David Bankston, retired URI professor, explaining the process and science behind the setting of the 5% rule for aquaculture in the coastal salt ponds. So we'll hope you will join us then as well. The aim is that, equipped with information on both aquaculture in general, from tonight, and the history and process of the 5% rule, that we will host a public meeting in June to discuss opportunities and challenges with aquaculture, now and in the future, to help guide policymakers. So we hope that this information really provides you with a great background of information. All information on these webinars will be shared through the SMP listserv. The presentation tonight is recorded. It will be posted online and available to you. We will also have summaries of this information in a Word document format that you can download. Just some general webinar participation reminders. Please feel free to type in your questions to the box off to the right. It's called Questions, Opportunities, and Challenges. However, we're going to reserve, the speakers will answer your questions in order, but they will do so at the end of both presentations. But feel free to type in any questions you have throughout. We'd also like to hear some of your thoughts regarding challenges and opportunities that you see with aquaculture. You can type those into that same box, and we'll basically compile those, and that will be sort of a launching point for our discussion at the June public meeting we plan to host. So again, please type in throughout the webinar any comments, questions, concerns you might have. And just take a few moments at the end of the webinars tonight to answer 4 different questions that we have. It helps give us a little bit of information about what you learned and how we can improve in the future and what other information we can provide to you. So with that, I'm happy to announce our first speaker, Professor Dale Levitt from Roger Williams University.
Good evening or good afternoon, folks. As soon as we get the next slide up, okay. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a very quick overview of what's going on for aquaculture in Rhode Island. And I will let you know right up front that when we talk about aquaculture in Rhode Island, we're primarily talking about shellfish aquaculture. And when we talk about shellfish aquaculture, we're primarily talking about the culture of oysters. So you'll notice that throughout my presentation, it's really going to focus on oyster aquaculture because that just is the overwhelming species that's currently being cultured. And so as you can see, the title of my talk is a quick overview of Rhode Island shellfish aquaculture. And you'll notice that I've got this nice photo of a couple of sailboats that are cruising across what is Duxbury Bay. And if you look way in the background, you can see the Miles Standish monument sticking up through the top of that little knoll on the backside. And so if you were to look at this same view from low tide, how do I make this? It's not going. Okay, hookah. So if you look, you can now see the same monument on the same hillside, and this is that same body of water at low tide, and what we see here is a shellfish aquaculture growing area that is using both bottom plant and some bottom cage systems, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. Just a little bit about me. I came down from Maine a number of years ago and worked for quite a number of years in Woods Hole for a few different institutions, and then was invited to come over to Rhode Island and work at Roger Williams University, where I am now a professor. But my appointment allows for 50% release time, and with that, I conduct aquaculture research and education and outreach opportunities such as we have here. So let's start a little with talking a little bit about shellfish and oysters specifically. These organisms all belong to the class of bivalvia. They're bivalve mollusks, which means that they have two shells or two valves. They're all filter feeders. They survive off consuming very small suspended particles in the water column, most of which are small single cell plant cells that are either swimming or drifting in the water. We're talking 2 to 3 microns, which is about 2 to 3 1,000ths of a millimeter in size. And one of the things that oysters are known for is their capacity to pump really large volumes of water. And under certain circumstances, it's been reported that an oyster will pump and filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. Oyster's really a very hardy creature. It ranges from Canada, Prince Edward Island, all the way down to the Yucatan Peninsula in the Gulf of Mexico. And so across that range, it can tolerate temperatures that go from below freezing all the way up to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. At the same time, it lives in estuaries where you can see salinity ranges from 0 for short periods of time up to full strength seawater at 35 parts per thousand. So it really is quite capable of living in a very wide array of environments. It goes through classic bivalve mollusk reproduction, where the adults, which you see in the lower left-hand corner, release their eggs and sperm directly into the water column. So fertilization results from the chance encounter of an egg with a sperm. And then as that fertile egg goes through a 2-week development cycle where the developing juvenile babies or larvae are actually free swimming up in the water column, where they are now distributed about the bay through water currents and their swimming ability. At some point, they become competent to metamorphose, where they will change their existence from a free swimming larvae down to a juvenile or very small oyster that has cemented itself down to some kind of hard substrate. They prefer to settle on other shellfish shells. And then over the next 2 to 3 years, they grow up to adult functioning reproductive oyster. Just a few terms that I might be using through the course of this that I'd like to clarify. The first is that idea of a larvae. It's the free swimming babies that are basically the first 2 to 3 weeks of an oyster's life. At some point, they become competent to metamorphose, where they are capable of making that transformation for a free swimming larvae to their adult body shape, but at a very reduced size. When they do metamorphose, they cement themselves down onto some kind of hard substrate, which we call settling or setting. And then at that point, they become an oyster spat, which is a juvenile oyster after it has cemented itself into a location. The aquaculturists refer to this stage as seed, and this is what they're purchasing from commercial hatcheries to put on their farms. In the wild, when we have a reproductive event, which we refer to as a cohort, settle on location and actually survive into a juvenile stage, then we refer to that as them recruiting into the population. So to give you a little bit of history of oysters in Rhode Island, oysters have really been an important resource for the state for many years. We've had wild stocks that are found throughout the upper bay as well as in the salt ponds, and both on the mainland and on Block Island. And we have scattered about the state shellfish middens, which are essentially occupation sites of Native Americans as they harvested and subsisted on oysters during certain times of the year. Shortly after the Civil War, the oyster became commercially important to the state. The Oyster Act of 1844, that was later amended in 1864, allowed the private use of the bay bottom to grow oysters. And so with this, Narragansett Bay became internationally renowned as a place to grow very well-received oysters for consumption. By 1910, the state was leasing over 21,000 acres of oysters for private cultivation and was collecting $10 an acre as a lease fee. And that generated over $700,000 a year to the state with those fees, which was a significant amount of money. Peak production was around 1911, where we produced over 15 million pounds of oysters, which, if you do a rough calculation, is equivalent to about $135 million in today's revenue. Rhode Island waters are really a unique area for oysters, and I say that for two reasons. One is that they grow really well here. We see oysters just flourish. It's not uncommon to have a edible size, market size oyster within 18 months of reproduction. However, while the juveniles grow well, it's very unpredictable and very rare that we have any kind of significant spat fall, where the natural oyster populations are going through any kind of recruitment into a wild fishery. So you may ask, if that's the case, then how did those oyster farms in the early 1900s sustain themselves? And basically what they were doing is they were going out to other areas in the region, primarily Long Island Sound and later on into Chesapeake Bay, and they were loading juvenile oysters onto flat cars, railroad cars, and were transporting them to Narragansett Bay, where they were transferred out into the bay so that we could take advantage of their capacity to grow very well here. So Narragansett Bay was basically just a grow out area using spat that was imported from other locations. That peak of 1911 pretty much was the heyday of oyster production in the early years, early 1900s of Rhode Island. And it crashed, as you can see in this graph, very precipitously for a whole host of different reasons. It wasn't really documented well, but we know obviously there were natural predators, including humans, poor spat fall in the surrounding region, which means that there was no seed to bring up to Rhode Island. And then we had a lot of damage due to the hurricane of '38, which pretty much spelled the doom of the oyster farming industry in the early 1900s. So whatever the cause, the oyster history of Rhode Island basically closed in 1952 with the closing of the Warren Oyster Company, the last oyster producing facility in the state. Excuse me. And shortly thereafter, the state legislature revoked the Oyster Act of 1844, which then reestablished our bay bottom as a free and common fishery. And the quahog really became the primary shellfish harvested from Rhode Island waters starting in the 1950s. So for wild oysters now, we do still have a smattering of native wild oysters in the bay. This map denotes some sites where you might be able to scrounge around and actually find an oyster or two. But we find that the populations in the bay and in the coastal ponds is extremely sporadic. And really the last time we had a major set of oysters in the area was in the mid-1990s, and that sustained an oyster fishery in the state for 2 or 3 years. More recently, we had a small but still a noticeable set in 2010, at least in Narragansett Bay, which did sustain for a short time a wild commercial fishery. So that leads us into sort of Rhode Island's modern era of oyster aquaculture. And that started with Luther Blount proposing to grow oysters in a small salt pond that he actually dug on Prudence Island in 1976. About similar, a little short time after that, Blue Gold, a company that was growing blue mussels, applied for and received an area and down by the Melville area of the bay that was 60 acres in size for growing blue mussels. And that went along until about 1985 when we had a brown tide event in the state waters, which basically killed most of the, if not all of the blue mussels in the bay, including all of those that were being grown at the Blue Gold site. In 1981, there was a rewrite of the aquaculture laws, which put the responsibility for managing aquaculture under the venue of the Coastal Resources Management Council. And they spelled out a system for hearing and review of all aquaculture leases, and included the Rhode Island Marine Fisheries Council as one of the institutions that would provide input on the licensing of aquaculture. Interest really was sparked by 1988 when Bob Rowe and his partner from Spatco Limited submitted an application for a very small lease in Point Judith Pond, which was the real first attempt at testing these 1981 aquaculture laws. And after 2 years of public hearings, which included over 14 different hearings by several agencies and boards, they were awarded a license, and the Moonstone oyster is still being produced in Point Judith Pond. So where do we stand today? This is Rhode Island aquaculture industry at a glance. This is from a report that's put out annually by the Coastal Resources Management Council and the aquaculture coordinator, Dave Butel. And we can see that in 2015, our number of farms had increased to 61 farms that encompassed 241, a little over 241 acres. On that bottom, they produced over 8 million oysters for consumption, which was a fairly significant jump from the year before. And the farm gate value for those products was a little over $5 million, which is now starting to approach the farm gate value of our quahog fishery in the bay. Our combined sales for all oyster products in the bay was around a little over $5.5 million. And the number of people that were actually employed by the aquaculture industry jumped by 20% in the past year. If you look at this graphically, these two, the red line represents the total total increase in acreage since 1996, and it sees that we're averaging an increase of about 12 acres per year in farmed acreage, and the actual number of farms is averaging an increase of about 2.8 new farms per year over the past 20 years or so. If you're wondering how Rhode Island stands in terms of the other East Coast growers, you can see that we're a fairly small player. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, Florida are all much larger in terms of their overall oyster production, although Rhode Island is growing in size, but at the same time, most of these states, their production is increasing significantly as well. So let's talk a little bit about what one does when one undergoes shellfish aquaculture. And it starts with an identification of broodstock. Those are the adults that will provide the eggs and sperm that lead to fertilized eggs. Those fertilized eggs develop into a larval rearing, into a larval stage where they're reared under special conditions, and then eventually they go through metamorphosis and they transition to juveniles. Under some circumstances, there's an opportunity to actually go out and catch wild juveniles instead of getting them through a culture process. If one is using these oysters for restocking, then this is the point at the end of this juvenile stage when the animals are released into the wild for restocking. If you are raising these oysters to grow on a farm, then they at some point are moved out to the farm site where they're held at the farm site until they are available for marketing. At the same time, a select group of oysters become, from that cohort, might become the broodstock for the next round of oyster production. So basically, we can break these steps down in aquaculture to three primary phases. We've got the hatchery phase, where we take the broodstock, generate eggs, and rear the larvae and metamorphose them and start the juvenile rearing process. Then we have a nursery where the juveniles are reared up to a point where they can then be moved out to the grow-out site. So in the hatchery, we're raising the larvae from a microscopic size. When they start swimming, when the fertile egg actually forms into a swimming larvae, they're about 100 microns in size, or 101,000ths of a millimeter. And they'll be raised up to about 2 millimeters in the hatchery. At the nursery, they take a nursery operator may take a 2 millimeter oyster and they'll hold it till it gets up to about 1 inch or 25 millimeters or so, and that might take 3 to 4 months. And then at 25 millimeters, they're generally moved out on the farm, where they are then reared up to a market size, which may be another 12 to 16 months. So if we were to look at this in terms of time scale, we can see here that this curve represents the growth of an oyster over the course of 18 months or so, with the red line indicating what the market size is. And we can see here that the hatchery stage lasts from March till about the end of May. Then the animals are transitioned out to the nursery, where they're held through the summer into August and into September, before they're finally moved out to the grow-out site, where they're held there until they grow up to full market size. This is probably an oyster nursery system that you might notice. It's the one on the left. This is called a floating upweller system, and the oysters are held in those square bins, such as the one you see sitting on the deck there. And the flow is constrained in these systems so that the water flows up through the mesh bottom of these bins and through the bed of shellfish before discharging through that turquoise colored pipe, that discharge pipe at the top of the bin. On the right-hand side, we can see a land-based upweller, which operates the same way, except it's not in a float, obviously. And then you can see these oysters that are in the hand at the top of the slide represent seed that is getting close to being the right size to move out onto the grow-out farm. In terms of grow-out, there are a number of different locations and strategies that are employed. People can grow oysters in land-based systems. They can grow oysters intertidally, or in the shallow subtidal, or if they get into deeper water, they may use floating gear, they may use suspended gear, and they may use on-bottom gear. And I'm going to show you some examples of these different types of grow-out strategies, but first we need to discount two of them. There are no land-based oyster production facilities that I'm aware of in the Northeast, and in Rhode Island, it is intertidal oyster culture is not allowed. And so everything that happens with oyster grow-out is occurring in the subtidal region. So let's look at some of these strategies. And that includes shallow subtidal, deeper water systems, bottom, midwater, and surface. So let's look at some of these technologies. So these are what we call bottom planted oysters, and basically they're raised in a nursery system till they get to be about 1.5 inches or 2 inches. And then they are just literally sprinkled on the bottom and allowed to grow up as if they were naturally occurring oysters on the bottom on the bed. At harvest time, the grower will go out with a small dredge, a modified scallop dredge or an oyster dredge, and will haul that across the bottom and basically scoop up those market-sized oysters, bring them up on deck, clean them up, and get them ready for market. Another alternative bottom culture system is using a tray system. And so this is an aquaculture site in a shallow water coastal pond where he's growing his oysters just in wire mesh cages that are sitting directly on the bottom. It's a fairly hard sandy bottom. And so it's a good spot for using this kind of technology. Another alternative for raising oysters on the bottom actually elevates them off the bottom a little bit. This is called a rack and bag system. And I'm showing you the photo on the left, which is actually an intertidal system for Massachusetts, but you can see what the strategy is here, where you have some kind of rack system. In this case, it's made out of rebar. Oftentimes they make it out of PVC pipe. And then the oysters are placed in these semi-rigid mesh bags and are lashed down to those tabletops so that they're elevated off the bottom a little bit, but are held in the water column. Which leads me to talk a little bit about oyster bags. This is sort of the standard method for containing oysters that are grown on an aquaculture farm. The reason they're held in these bags is first to keep them in one location so they're fairly easy to handle. And secondly, it excludes predators from coming in and consuming oysters. And so you will see that most of the gear that I show you is some system that's adapted to hold these bags. So this is another bottom system that is used in a little bit deeper water. This is called a bottom cage. And as you can see, it's a wire mesh, basically just a shelf like a bookcase that allows those individual oyster bags to be slipped in on each of the levels of the cage. And then that cage is then released onto the bottom as if it were a lobster trap or some kind of structure. It just sits on the bottom. They come in a whole variety of different configurations that hold anywhere from 2 up to 10 of those oyster bags. And as you can well imagine, they're fairly unwieldy things, a little bit difficult to handle, and so oftentimes it requires some specialized boats and equipment to actually handle cages, especially something like these, the very large ones, which is actually a 12-bag system that was designed to discourage people from coming out at night and lifting that off the bottom to help themselves to the oysters. So this, whenever we have bottom culture in effect, this is basically what you see. It's nothing more than a series of buoys at the surface which are marking either trawl lines of cages or boundaries for the licensed area where the oyster farm is in operation. If we look at growing these things in suspended culture, this is a diagram from a Japanese document on various ways that one can grow shellfish in suspended culture. In Rhode Island, we do have a few farms that are using suspended culture, and they're using these stacks of plastic trays or cages that each level holds a certain number of oysters, and then each stack of cages is hung off one of those black buoys that you see in the background. And so the oysters are held on a long line, which is basically like a clothesline that's suspended in a long array with buoys evenly spaced along it. And under each one of those black buoys is a stack of oyster cages, which hang in the midwater off the bottom. If we look at floating gear, this is a design of a system that some of you may be familiar with if you've been involved at all with the oyster gardening program that was operating here for a number of years. These are called Taylor floats, and they're nothing more than a wire mesh cage that has some kind of flotation ring attached to the top so that when you put them in the water, the cage is floating right at the surface, which gives a little better opportunity for growing oysters because the water's warmer and the food's a little bit more concentrated, but it has some problems, particularly in the wintertime where you have to sink stuff to get it away from the winter ice. Another technology that is becoming more popular is what we call a floating bag system. And this is nothing more than those oyster bags, and now they've been adapted by adding some small flotation devices to the edges. In this case, they're just those classic swim noodles that you get for the kids, very inexpensive. They're nylon zip tied onto the bag, and then the bag is attached to a clothesline type long line that's strung between 2 anchors. The beauty of these is that you can flip them over and it helps with fouling control, which is a major issue with these oyster farms. A technology that's becoming more popular of late is this floating cage system we refer to as oyster grow cages. And as you can see on the right here, there's two flotation billets that have a wire mesh cage associated with it. And within that wire mesh cage would slip up to 6 oyster bags. And you can see that this is a farm in the lower left-hand corner out on Hog Island that uses exclusively oyster grow cages. The beauty of these is that when they're in their normal configuration with the flotation up, then the oysters are being held at the surface in this optimal growing condition. But because of fouling control, the grower has the opportunity to invert the whole cage system and allows the cage to air dry up in the atmosphere, in the air. And what that does is it allows the cage system to dry out and thereby killing a lot of the soft organisms, the tunicates and the algae that's growing on the mesh, which may disrupt water flow to feed, provide oxygen to the oysters. So wanted to just conclude quickly with some things to consider in terms of our oyster farming. One is that oysters are renowned for a variety of ecological services that they provide to the water body that they're being cultured in. That includes water filtration. We've already talked about them filtering up to 50 gallons of water a day and extracting particles down to 2 to 3 microns. As they do that, they're removing nutrients out of the system, which is a real big problem with our estuarine environments. And they provide a lot of habitat for other marine organisms, many of them important to us. They also, our aquaculture industry provides a number of societal services, including sustaining a working waterfront as our fishing industry becomes more and more challenged. And it provides economic input into the community by supporting marine-related industries as well as just generating jobs itself. There are a number of public concerns that people have raised, and we're not here to spend a lot of time talking about these, but I will like to mention them, that we see that aquaculture is sort of the new kid on the block, and it's sort of a deviation for what most people are used to seeing along their coastal environment. And so that really has caused a little consternation. We have had a checkered history of aquaculture efforts earlier. Blue Gold is probably a prime example of that, where after the failure of the farm, they just abandoned the site and left a lot of mess there. Unfortunately, fortunately, that's not an option now because of bonding of the sites. We certainly have a number of space use conflicts between commercial fisheries, recreational users, and the aquaculturists. And we also run into a number of issues with the aquaculture impacting viewscapes from upland landowners. All of these we refer to as social carrying capacity. It's sort of the level by which aquaculture can develop before it is unacceptable to society in general. And lastly, there has been some history of aquaculture being responsible for moving invasive species around, but that has become relatively controlled through actions of groups such as the Biosecurity Council that's maintained by CRMC to address the movement of shellfish around the state. Another thing to consider is that this is aquaculture is a carefully regulated enterprise. We see CRMC as the lead agency in regulating and managing aquaculture in the state, but they do so in consultation with other state agencies, primarily DEM and the Department of Health. At the same time, there is considerable federal oversight through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which consults with a whole host of federal agencies, including EPA, Fish and Wildlife, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, USDA, etc. So if one were to look at the regulatory environment for permitting aquaculture, this is a flow diagram that was put together by CRMC that sort of outlines the process that one goes through to become licensed to raise shellfish in Rhode Island. And it involves a very large opportunity for input from a number of different agencies and as well as the public before final decision is put forth through the CRMC, the council. And that could either be approval or denial. And so the last thing I want you to consider is the fact that shellfish aquaculture in general is an industry of success is entirely dependent on water quality. And I think maybe the diatom bloom of the past couple of weeks really points that out, in that if the water is closed, if the waters are closed for the harvesting of shellfish for any reason, that has a direct and immediate impact on our industry members as well as the wild harvest fisheries. And so it behooves the industry to become sort of very high level advocates for maintaining water quality in the state. And along those lines, there are a number of published best management practices manuals that are available to the shellfish aquaculture industry. The one that we show here is one that was put together by the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association. But what that does is it provides a series of recommendations in terms of how an aquaculture business should conduct itself to minimize the environmental risk of the operation. And so with that, I would just point you to a number of different websites that are currently available that have a lot of really good information, some of which is specific to Rhode Island and some of it's a little bit more generic. But these sites provide a very well developed pieces of information on aquaculture in Rhode Island and along the East Coast. And so with that, we have opened it up so that you can type in your questions, but we will address those once Dr. Devaney finishes with his survey of research directions that are currently underway by Rhode Island Sea Grant.
Okay, thank you, Dale, for the intro. I am the assistant director here at the Rhode Island Sea Grant program. I have a history with shellfish. I did thesis work on an aquaculture farm where I worked for several years, raising oysters, clams, scallops, and also served on from a management perspective on a shellfish commission where we spent a lot of time with aquaculturists wanting to do various kinds of aquaculture in shallow water. So I've been around on both ends of both the growing and then on sort of the regulatory side at a town level. Sea Grant, just to give you a very brief nugget of what the Sea Grant program is we, there are 33 programs nationwide, and all of the programs have a couple of components. The largest component is funding of research. The research that goes on is really through university-based systems. So we fund academics to do research in particular areas. What I'm going to talk about this evening is research that we've conducted that has some relationship directly with aquaculture. We then have a number of extension specialists like Azure Sigler who work with the researchers and then work with resource managers to essentially take research findings and try and put them into practice. It was interesting. I went back and looked at sort of a history of research, and it was interesting that one of the very first research project funded by Rhode Island Sea Grant in 1969 was a project looking at genetics of aquaculture. And it didn't say genetics of what, and I couldn't find the original report, but I suspect that it had to do with salmon. Over the course of history, there's been a lot of research conducted around algae, salmon. There was a little bit around sea turtles at one time. I found that interesting, and not many instances of that. Also, quite a bit of work looking at summer and winter flounder from an culture perspective, a little bit with cod, haddock, and then, of course, much more when we get into the shellfish area around quahogs, oysters in particular, a little bit about scallops, and now in the more contemporary time, looking a lot more at mussels, diseases, some genetics, and those aspects. There we go. I'm going to cover just some recent research that has taken place really in the past maybe decade. We funded some initial research in collaboration with Charlie Yarish over at University of Connecticut, and they were looking at a particular type of green algae that is really a nuisance on some oyster aquaculture farms. And the thought was, well, can we take that nuisance and turn it into something that can be of economic value? Perry Rasso at the Matunic Oyster Farm had some part in that, and there was a researcher here at URI, Chong Lee, who looked at the elements of once you harvest this stuff for cleaning it, what's the nutritional value, what can you do and what shouldn't you do to make this palatable to both the eye and mouth. You start to see this gracilaria marketed now sometimes as sea vegetables. You do see it in seaweed salads. It's fairly common. I wouldn't say it's a thriving industry, but it's up and coming. You do see it around in many seafood markets and every so often in a restaurant. We've also funded both a little bit back in the past and then at present some work on whelks, the large snails that are found here subtidally in New England waters. Michael Rice at here at URI had a student look at trying to answer the question, is whelk suitable for aquaculture? And at least the bottom line from that short research project was no, they couldn't find really a suitable food that the whelk would go to on a consistent basis and eat enough of it to fatten up and grow at a rate that was going to be anything but abysmally slow. And as we all know, you can wait maybe a little bit of time to get to market, but you can't wait forever to get to market. We have recently been funding some work in the wild on stocks. It's not so much related to aquaculture at the moment. It is helping to answer some basic questions about their biology here in Rhode Island waters, which if and when other researchers get around to perhaps wanting to think again about, as we learn more about whelks, is it something that could be, grown in a culture setting, then perhaps this research will have some value. Disease is a huge issue throughout, both in wild settings. There are a number of diseases that can really wreak havoc with a aquaculture farm. And in particular, many of the diseases are very, very nasty if they get an outbreak in a hatchery setting where things are confined. The next thing you know, you can lose an entire crop, which means an entire year with no income. Not a very palatable thing for a hatchery to think about. Blue mussels are being more closely looked at as an aquaculture potential species, both for raising them in a hatchery and then getting them out onto long lines. It seems to be very feasible, but there are a number of diseases out there, and we are funding Roxana Smolowitz over at Roger Williams University to basically take a look at some of the more common disease problems with blue mussels being grown in a wild environment and trying to get some sense of could this be a problem for mussel aquaculture? And if so, can she perhaps find some thoughts with regard to how to go about avoiding those? Some initial research findings that she's getting is that there is a big spike in looking at trematodes, which are a waterborne parasite of mussels. They become much more common right at the end of summer. Many mussels are infected, some of them severely so. And what it causes is that the mussels, what they call the condition index, goes down and they become less marketable. They start to look kind of nasty. Many of them don't reproduce well, which then doesn't bode well for the coming crop of the following year. And then many of them in bad disease outbreaks simply die. While not proven to be causal, she is seeing a lot of coincidence between some of the mass mussel die-offs in the bay and the time of peak abundance of some of these trematode infections. So she's looking more closely at that to see, is there some cause and effect there? The jury's still out on that part. Another thing that, a couple of things she has found that point to some potential problems for aquaculture is that the juveniles get infected while they're in the water column because the trematodes are free swimming in the water. Those then carry the disease forward so that the adults then will have that with them as they grow. The other thing she's found is that the trematodes are very common in the guts of mollusk-eating fishes like scup and tautog, which then, of course, hang around the mussel beds and the oyster or mussel farms, which again could be problematic. Roxana is at the moment also looking at Vibrio, which is another disease that doesn't so much hurt the oysters, but is a problem for humans if we ingest the oysters in a raw state that are heavily infected with Vibrio. She's just started this research, so if I come back and do a similar talk in another year or two, I might have something more to say. Then, tune in a little bit later. We are currently also funding some folks here at URI. Again, Roxana Smolowitz over at Roger Williams also is involved, but Serena Mosman Valtierra here at URI is looking at potential impacts of climate change to oysters. Here in being grown in the salt ponds in Narragansett Bay, her focus is down in the salt ponds. She's really looking to find out that interplay between rising temperature, and as temperature rises and nutrients become more common in shallow waters, there's sort of a combined effect of those two where the can cause very stressful conditions for the oysters, which reduces their growth, which is not a good thing from a grower's perspective. One of the things she is finding is that in heavily enriched waters, as she's doing these studies in the laboratory, is that normally oysters remove nitrogen from the water under more enriched and problematic conditions. They can turn around and actually start doing the opposite of that. She's also finding that under some of these stressed conditions, again, the oyster growth is generally much slower. She hasn't found any incidents where, in temperatures that we might expect in the next through like 2030 to 2050 would suggest that oysters would be dying. But from a grower's perspective, higher water temperatures and then the combination with nutrients is going to mean they're going to get slower growth out of the oysters, and the slower they grow, the more opportunity then for diseases and other sorts of nasty things to happen. We've also funded some other work on oysters, looking again from a sort of a disease perspective, but looking at it from the other end, and that is how can we prevent disease. We funded David Rowley, professor here at URI, to look at oysters. They have a natural growth of bacteria on their shells in the natural environment. And some of those bacteria he has been working with and tracing out their genetics and trying to then grow them. They have these probiotic, or a probiot is a natural occurring bacteria that has a positive health impact. And he's finding that by having an availability of these good bacteria, it can actually reduce the incidence of disease in the oysters, particularly at the juvenile phases when they're at the highest risk in the hatchery. He isolated at least 2 bacteria that have very high probability of being able to be applied in a hatchery setting. He is now trying them in a commercial hatchery setting to see how, if that's what he's seen in the laboratory on small scale, if that will ramp up into a, where you're treating, thousands, if not millions of juvenile oysters, and will that carry through? Another thing that many of you have probably heard about is the lobster shell disease. You see by the picture here on screen, it's a very nasty looking thing. It causes much stress to the oysters and seems to be related perhaps to increasing temperatures. The jury is still out on sort of the causal end of things, but there's no need to deliberate the impacts to the populations, which can be significant. We're currently funding Kathy Castro here at URI to do some work, again, looking at the natural bacterial flora on the lobster shell to isolate some bacteria and see if she can use those to actually treat the lobsters to reduce the incidence of disease. She's just started that work. So again, the jury's out. You're going to hear me say that probably too often, but with research, we've only started funding a lot of this stuff over the past 3 to 4 years. When the projects run 2 to 3 years in extent, then they need, the scientists need some time to then look through, consolidate their results, and sort of come up with some answers to things. It takes some time. Not directly related to aquaculture per se, we have been funding some work by Scott Rutherford over at Roger Williams and Chris Kincaid here at URI to look at how shellfish larvae move around in the bay. It's important from a biological, natural setting to know where the larvae are going. It's also interesting and important to know from a growing perspective, because if part of aquaculture gives the organisms, whether they're clams or oysters, the opportunity to spawn, then those larvae are going to end up going somewhere in the bay, and it's useful from a management perspective then to know where these larvae are settling, and then to perhaps look at those areas, perhaps not as a marine reserve, but as a place to curtail other activities to give larvae a chance to then grow up, as Dale was showing, from juvenile to adult phase, and keep the populations going. A few interesting results is that the Providence River, no surprise, is a big area for pumping quahog larvae into the bay, and much of that larvae is retained in the upper bay, and anything that makes its way down to about Rome Point then really gets flushed right out of Narragansett Bay. We've also been funding some folks over at the Commercial Research Fisheries Foundation. Anna Malik Mercer is the lead researcher on that, but Dale has been intimately involved with this work as well, working with quahog harvesters to collect data as they're bull raking, and see if that data can then be used by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management for stock assessment. Again, not directly related to aquaculture, but important from the overall end of shellfish management in the state. We have just very recently funded some work looking at ocean acidification here in New England waters. This is a regional undertaking by all 7 Sea Grant programs ranging from New York up to Maine. It's a very huge issue out on the West Coast, where that top picture, some of the oysters you can see, the shells are all riddled and pitted. No, that's not by snails or any other kind of predator, but from the acidity of the water actually pocking their shells and in essence dissolving it. You can see across that bottom row that with the small clam or oyster larvae there, the under different scenarios of carbon dioxide or in the atmosphere, which then relates to acidification in the ocean, it's really has the potential to slow down the growth of many shellfish. And so we are funding a couple of research projects, one looking at sand lance, because then as ocean acidification increases, the shellfish become stressed, have a hard time grabbing calcium out of the water to make important things like shells and skeletons out of. Those, again, just starting, but also looking at lobsters and mussels, another couple of important species, and the results of those will be directly applicable to aquaculture here in the Rhode Island area. We're funding a few other what Dale referred to as ecosystem service types of research projects. Wally Fulweiler, who is a grad student here at URI, now up at Boston University, is looking at sediments under aquaculture farm sites and looking at them to see if she's seeing any changes in nitrogen movement within the sediments under aquaculture farms. Interestingly enough, she's finding that there is an initial change in the sediments where nitrogen is taken up and then is actually released at a higher rate than in non-farm sites. But after a couple of years, those go back to normal. Mark Stolt here at URI also looking at impacts in the sediments and is finding that those things, again, are on a cycle. They have some short-term impact and then are gone. Dale talked about the social impacts of social caring capacity. We're funding 2 projects, one by Tracy Dalton, one by Rob Thompson, who are looking at how much aquaculture is considered by us people, perhaps too much aquaculture. They're finding mixed results to that, and the research is still underway. And then finally, we did have funded a little bit of work on fish aquaculture, not important here in Rhode Island at the moment because there is none, but it's important at a regional scale, just really looking at some different feeds. So Azure, back to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Robbie's just going to pull up a closing slide, and as you can see on the bottom right-hand corner, many of you have been asking questions, and we've been able to answer those as we go, which has been really helpful. But in the last couple minutes, I'm just going to thank Dale for your presentation and Alan for yours as well. Their contact information, my contact information, and the website where all the archived presentations will be is up on the screen now, and I hope you'll join us November 30th for our webinar, Understanding the 5% Rule in the Coastal Salt Ponds. And so while we do have a couple more minutes, we'll please just type in any questions you have, and then either Alan or Dale can just sort of verbally answer those. And while we're also going to pull up on the screen a couple of polls, survey questions, please feel free to answer those in between typing in any questions or comments you might have. And again, we will get to those before we wrap up in a minute or so. We thank you all very much for joining us, and we'll stay live and recording for another minute or two so that you can ask some questions. Thank you again, and please stay tuned. We hope to see you all back participating in the webinar November 30th. So with looks like we've been able to answer all your questions, but if you do come up with others, please either email Dale, Alan, or myself, and we'll do our best to answer them. And thank you for chiming in on the polls. And we hope to participate in a webinar with you on the 30th. Thank you all very much for joining us.